All right, welcome everybody back to another episode of the Big Douglas Show. My guest today is analytics analysis from ESPN, Seth Walder. Seth, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Let's see, you're at ESPN now. I'm curious how you kind of got your start in the sports world.
Sure. Yeah, I started after college. I worked as a high school sports reporter at the New York Daily News. So I covered high school sports in the five boroughs, and that was a really challenging job. Obviously that's a ton of high schools, and I wasn't from here, so I had a lot to learn, and I did that. It was a really good experience. I got my big like break, so to speak, when the Jets traded for Tim Tebow. And my editor called me into her office and she said, "We want to send you to Jets training camp. We just want you to write about Tim Tebow every day." And I was like, "Okay, great." And so I did that. I think they were like, I used to know the stat. I think it was like there were 23 days of training camp and we got 20 days of Tebow stories, like almost every day. And he only talked every third day too, you know?
Right.
So that went well. I covered, stayed on, became the Jets backup beat writer, and then later became a beat writer at the Daily News. And later I covered the Giants a little bit. And then in 2017, I jumped over to ESPN as a sports analytics writer.
And the analytics part of it, was that something that always interested you? You had your original you got started in business, right? So the numbers maybe helped a little bit. Is that true?
Oh no, I started in journalism.
Okay.
So, yeah, so no business background, but I was always really interested in the quantitative side of sports. Like for people my age, it's like very cliche, but I read Moneyball when I was in high school, and I was a huge baseball fan, and I remember just changing the way I thought about this game that I loved so much, and that always stuck with me. Became a big Fangraphs reader and all that. I was really interested in the quantitative side of sports, and I paid close attention to what was happening in football analytics at the time when I was a beat writer covering the Jets and Giants. I didn't have the technical skills to work in analytics, but it was a move I wanted to make. And I knew that it was going to be really difficult to make that move because I didn't have a traditional statistical training and I didn't know how to code at the time. And so I was lucky enough to get this job where my role was to explain or tell stories of sports stories with the metrics that our teams created, and have to do all the modeling myself. And then I'm really fortunate because I get to work with all these super smart people, and then I've been able to gain a lot of those technical skills that I didn't have. Not like my coworkers, but I could do some stuff.
You mentioned Moneyball, and it feels like football is the last to kind of been drug into the analytics. Where are you? Where are we? Do you think football wise and the numbers compared to maybe like where baseball is?
Probably I asked this question. I do a survey. I didn't do it this last year, but I've most years, every other year, I do a survey of analytics staffers around the league, and I asked them.
I saw it pinned to your Twitter.
Right. Yeah. Right. Oh, yeah. Right. So I do that is like my list, but then I reach out to them and survey them a whole bunch of questions, and yeah, and that was kind of a question I asked, and I think that the answer, like the average answer, was something like, I don't know, 8 years behind baseball or something like that. Some people felt like a full decade was a little bit much because just so much happens. But yeah, probably something like 8 to 10 years behind baseball. I mean, they're just in another world. I mean, even from just a staffing standpoint, I don't think that's the entire world, like entire way to look at it. But I asked someone that worked for a baseball team recently, how many analytics staffers do you have? And he said, well, let's put it this way. Each of our minor league affiliates has two apiece. So in some, that's the size of an NFL staff in some cases. So I think that gives you a pretty good sense of how different we're talking.
The numbers, I must admit, I'm not the brightest when it comes to these things. That's why I enjoy having folks like yourself on. What do the numbers change? I guess, like, are there between the sports? Can we get more value out of the numbers depending on the sport, where the numbers are the numbers and we just need to figure out how best to use them?
Hmm. I guess I would answer the question this way. I think in football, there's a lot more to be gained through quantitative analysis at this point than there is in baseball at this point, because it's so much farther behind that even though it's so much more complex, right? That like that's one of the reasons why we are where we are, because analyzing football quantitatively is more complex than analyzing baseball quantitatively. The baseball has gotten so advanced that teams are fighting for these smaller edges at this point. And when we talk about football, if we look at the last 5 years or the next 5 years, I think you can have simpler takeaways that will gain you more, just because not everybody's doing it.
What do you think is the biggest edge that we're looking for currently, or that we use?
It's a good question. I think this has shrunk to some degree. My standard answer here is probably what I guess I'd stick to. My standard answer in the past has always just been, it's super simple, but like run pass splits, right? The league is much more efficient passing the ball than it is running the ball. I think that's still the number one thing. That's not true for every team. So you can't just put this blanket statement and say you need to pass more. That's not true for every team. On average, teams should be passing more. On average, teams with good quarterbacks are not taking enough advantage of the fact that they have better quarterbacks. Like I said, this has shrunk as defenses. I think it's really been a defensive adjustment. It's not that teams are passing more and the gains have gotten less, but rather the defenses have started to prioritize passing less. I mean, like, it's such a simple answer. I'd like, and sometimes I think, right, because like I remember someone once saying like someone that worked in another sport, like, average yards per run, 4.2, average yards per pass play, 7.2. Ooh, I did it. I saw football, right? And it's like, it's so much more complex than that. And at the same time, sometimes that is such a large gap that there is some truth to that. I think that's still the biggest edge available. If you have a good quarterback, that you should be leaning more into that.
If the numbers support passing more, it feels like we'll get because because of that, safeties are getting smaller. It feels like, right? Our linebackers are getting a little bit smaller so they can get quicker and faster. Previously, it feels like when you catch an edge like this, eventually teams will get back to saying, well, you know what? If you're going to continue defending me like a pass first team, then we'll get bigger up front, we'll get bigger at running back, and we'll start smashing you. Is that something that we should be expecting in the next couple of years, or is the benefit of passing so much greater that we won't get to this cyclical nature where we're back to try to figure out, okay, everybody's defending me for the pass, I'll get back to running the ball?
I think the cyclical nature is natural because everybody is incentivized to try and win. And so it just makes sense that if everyone looks at what I just described, right, then the league will, as it has been, slowly trend more towards passing, both in terms of offense and defense. And yes, that naturally opens up the opportunities for teams. I mean, maybe, I don't know here, but like when we think about like the Ravens in their Lamar Jackson MVP season, and we think about how well they ran the ball, and that was also a time when we have all these zone running teams, and they were coming with like power, a power running scheme, and it's like, were they extra successful because every team was trying to stop something that was built to stop something that wasn't them? Probably. So yeah, I think that it's not like that running isn't going to be a part of the game. I think what you described makes a total, absolutely makes sense.
We watch, I don't know how much of the game you saw, but this is Commander's podcast, and I was thinking about when KJ Henry gets the sack that wasn't a sack. Like, how far off are we from the rules changes that they'll totally change the way the game is? Like, do you see a scenario where you see the padded helmets in practice, will we get to a point where we're lessening some of that stuff a la rugby to lessen the hits that so like they're changing to like how far are we off from this version of football that's totally different than what we see now? Do you think we'll get there?
That's really hard for me to answer. I think what's safe to say is that certainly the changes rule changes have an effect. And I think that can be as simple as like even when the league prioritizes certain things or deprioritizes. Like the one year, a couple of years ago, when they basically stopped calling holding, and it's like offense skyrocketed, right? Because everybody realized we can get away with a little bit more. And so all of a sudden it looks like everybody's blocking better. And now now every passing offense is more efficient than it was. And then it goes back to normal. And so we know that like those sort of things all have macro effects. Right. If it got to a certain, it's like not there yet. Like sacks are super valuable. If you got to a place where so many of these plays were getting called or getting flagged, that maybe teams would start to adjust and say, hey, it's actually not worth it to try and get a sack. Like maybe we're going to play coverage, but we're not there. And I don't know that we're going there. Like just because it's traded in that direction doesn't mean I think that it necessarily will be. Certainly, like any rule change, any emphasis does have a macro effect, though.
All right, I asked you to come on because you were the first person that I had seen at least that broke the Eugene Shen news to the Commanders. Tell us a little bit about him. Let's start there. Tell us a little bit about Eugene Shen.
Yeah, Eugene Shen's, I mean, an analytics veteran in the sense that he's been working in football analytics for a long time. I put that in air quotes because I think he started in 2012, maybe 2014, something like that, which is a long time in the time of football analytics, right? When he started working for the Ravens, that was not a time when there were that many staffers to begin with. So he has a lot of experience working for multiple organizations. Started with the Ravens. Obviously, Baltimore has been at the forefront of kind of the analytics movement over the last decade or so. Went to Miami and then Jacksonville, and then has been working in finance for the last 2 years or so, a little under that. So a really experienced person. I think it says a lot to me. He was a vice president in Jacksonville. He's a senior vice president with the Commanders. It says to me, this title says a lot. I think I'm inferring, I don't know, but I'm inferring because we're putting multiple things together here, right? We've got Josh Harris. We know he's got other teams that have been quant forward. The Commanders have been one of the least analytically inclined organizations in the NFL. And one of the first moves he makes is to bring in a senior vice president. So this is going to be someone very high up in the football organization who has a full quantitative background. To me, I think that speaks to probably like, it's sort of like what we all expected, but I think it's a signal of the direction that this team is going to go. Most teams do not have a senior vice president who's coming from an analytics background. And so I think it's a really clear sign to me about what's to come in Washington, at least in terms of quantitative analysis.
It's interesting. You mentioned the Ravens and them kind of being at the forefront, and that was one of the things that I had always thought. And then I went and looked at your chart, and there were like 2 people on the list for the Ravens. And so I'm curious, like what when you put the list together on that tweet, I'm curious how it was kind of like. Does that mean they have 2 people, or those are the only 2 people that are being talked about? And maybe I had that wrong.
I've got them with 6, I think, right now.
Okay. All right.
They're not as large as as a few other teams, but
it was 2 for the Commanders, right? You would expect that number to change drastically for them.
For the Commanders, absolutely, yeah. And I don't know if it will change, before the offseason, but I suspect by the time we get to kickoff next year, that number would certainly have changed. I mean, the reality is, if you want to have a staff that's going to help you in terms of player evaluation and the draft and helping coaching, both game management and game planning, like that's a lot of different tasks. They all take place over the entire course of the season. You need people. We're talking about large scales of data. You need developers. You're going to need data scientists. Like, I think that staff will change. Will certainly change. I think like you could look at Dallas, who sort of overhauled over this last offseason, and that would be kind of similar, where they didn't even hire, right? They just hired a new director, brought in like 3 analysts and an engineer. So like that kind of thing might happen.
People have said to me, he's the vice president of football strategy and he's a numbers guy, but that will be a different part of the building. I've kind of been getting the sense that no, he'll have a much larger role than that. Would you expect somebody with his title to be heavily involved in the GM process?
I would think so. This is
what do you think his role will be, I guess? Because a lot of people ask me, like, what will Shen's role be? How much power in the organization does he now have?
That's a hard question for me to answer without more inside information. So I don't want to that's a tricky one for me to say because I don't know. But I would just say it's a big title. So I think that probably tells you a decent amount. When they say different part of the building, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's football operations. I don't know. I don't know what I suspect. And I think if I recall, I think Ron Rivera even mentioned that Shen played a role in the Montez Sweat and Chase Young deals. Am I correct in that? I thought I saw that.
Yes, he did.
So, I mean,
yeah,
that's probably like his first day on the job. So, or something close to it. So,
yeah, it was odd. Technically, it wasn't supposed to be his first day on the job. I think the date they said that he starts taking his position is like November 6th.
Yeah, so there you go. Right.
But obviously, and you had those ranked how as far as those trades.
Well, I thought the Montez Sweat trade was a home run for the Commanders. I thought it was even more of an error for Chicago than it was a home run for the Commanders. And I know it's a Commanders podcast, so maybe it doesn't matter. But for Chicago, strategically, it just doesn't make any sense, I don't think. For Washington, I think it makes all the sense in the world. I like everyone, I guess, I assumed that they would maybe trade one or the other, right? And so I was looking at it before the trade deadline, and I felt like Sweat was the one to move. He had probably a higher reputation, I thought, wasn't sure. Seems like it based on the compensation. But also, like, we think he's 3 years older than Chase Young. And, from our advanced metrics, Sweat has not been that great. He ranks low in pass rush win rate, like really low, bottom 10 kind of edge rusher. Now, I do think that we missed something, and when we talk about powerful pass rushers who push the pocket, some of that's not reflected in pass rush win rate. And I think Sweat is maybe underrated by our numbers for that. But I'm like, to me, it's very clearly not an elite edge rusher. That's what I would call Sweat. You can say he's a good player, and that's fine, but I wouldn't call him elite. And so to have a guy who is 27, you're a non-contender, you're going to get an early 2. I mean, this could be picked like 30, 34 or something, like 36, to get that for him without, when he's about to be the last year of his deal, to me, that just makes so much sense. I mean, right? Like, and one of the reasons why it's so bizarre that Chicago traded for him is because you can look at it and say, well, he's cheap for, these next 9 games, right? That could be really useful to a contender. You get a good, someone who needs a pass rusher. Oh, you get a good, cheap Montez Sweat. Like, I can get on board with that if you're trying to go win the Super Bowl. But that's not much, right? So he's not really useful to Washington over the next 9 games. He's not really useful to Chicago. Now they go and sign him to a big long-term deal. That's fine, but they still paid for this in draft capital for that cheap rest of this half year. So anyway, to me, I thought that was right. I was surprised the Sweat deal an A for the Commanders. I gave him a C plus for dealing Young. I don't think it's the end of the world by any means. I can understand the justification for sure, which will be pretty similar to what I just said, which is like you're a non-contender, you have this player, you can get draft capital for him now. And I think there's a counter that comes, which is like, well, you could just let him go and gotten a comp pick. I think that's overstated because the Commanders have quite a bit of cap space next season. They might be spenders in free agency. That comp pick is not guaranteed. To me, the reason I would have kept Young is because he's a young player that I would think about building around. Like I mentioned, our pass rush win rate. I mean, he's been right on the fringe of top 10 in that this year. We're talking about a player who, yes, we have a huge middle part of his Commander's tenure that did not go anywhere close to plan. We're still talking about an elite prospect, performed right away at the NFL level. And then, yes, the injuries I'm sure are a concern. And that's one part that's hard for me to know. It's not like I have information there, but he's also come back and is playing really well now. So that to me is a guy that's like, and he's young. So I would say that's probably where I would just want to tag him and or pay him.
I wanted them to tag him at least for a year and see what was going on. It sounds like it was not a talent or injury thing that is why he's not here anymore. Now, the frustrating thing for me with that was if he had lost favor with the coaching staff, and that seems to be that's what it was on both sides. I don't think sounds like he was ready to move on as well. But for the organization to let him go, for a staff that most likely won't be here next year, was frustrating to me. And I guess as long as Shen and part of the ownership group helping make those decisions make me feel a little bit better, because that's the hard thing in Washington is to kind of know who's making those decisions at the deadline and for who.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I think it's funny, right? Most of the time when we talk about ownership and people talk about them meddling in football affairs, it's seen as a negative. And I think I've evolved on this point. I don't think it is, in fact, a negative by default. The ownership is the only group that can like truly have the long-term organization's view. And lack of movement is also a decision. And so I think about, you can look across the league and look at situations where, to me, like I think Carolina a year ago turned down 2 ones for Brian Burns. That is a failure of ownership because an owner needs to know at that point, this is a deal you cannot turn down. And B, you have to know like how are right. I think you're looking at probably a GM trying to save their job. And if a GM is behaving in that manner, then you have failed as an owner because you cannot have a GM who is sitting in a situation where they are trying to save their job. I think about Las Vegas right now and keeping Davante Adams, not quite as clear cut because he's, it's not like a contract year, but like that team's going nowhere. Like we talked about with Sweat, the rest of this year for Davante Adams, I mean, he's older. That's, the rest of this year for Davante Adams, that's a really valuable asset. That is being just, it's like a car. He's just depreciating, right?
Yeah.
Right. But you could cash in on that right now and help your future self. And that to me is a failure of ownership that you don't trade Davante Adams right now. And so, I mean, that's a failure of GMing too, but they got fired the same day. I don't know the order of operations, but like ultimately the owner was going to be there. So I think that he deserves blame. And so I do think that ownership playing some sort of role, while it's dangerous, right? You're talking about people who are not like, right. Maybe they don't have a background in football, or there's varying degrees of that. You need to have this long-term organizational view that's not being like influenced by job security, which so often can, or really empower your people to understand that they have job security and can think about the long-term view.
Well, I was just going to say, because the point you made is an excellent one, and I hadn't really quite looked at it that way. I had thought about it because we talk on this podcast all the time, just because of the way they set it up with Ron Rivera being GM and head coach, and how that's an impossibly hard dynamic to kind of live in the middle of because their jobs are completely different. The GM is supposed to be looking to the future. Head coaches have to be winning right now. Do owners have, and if not, should they then have somebody that works with them that is in it for the long haul, more of a consigliere, if you will, on how it works? Because to your point, GM's lifespans can be short as well.
I don't know. I mean, that's interesting. I guess I hadn't really thought about it like that. Ultimately, it's kind of like, well, you're the owner. You have to figure out the long-term success of the organization. Whatever you need to do to make that happen, right? Whether that's your own research or bringing in someone who's going to be a trusted advisor or whatever. Like, however you do that is probably fine as long as you do that and do that well. And like, yeah, like, so in short, I always think it's like, it's okay to have ownership involved in football operations. You just need them to make good decisions, which sounds like, that's like the, like, just pick the good players in the draft, but seriously, like, I just think but I think they have to do that's just part of their job. And I do think that we ought to evaluate teams ownership a lot more. I think it does play a pretty significant role. And we don't know what happened here, right? But like, you can imagine a world where Ron Rivera, if I don't know this happened, I'm just like speculating, right? But you can imagine a world where if Ron Rivera had 100% say, and he could say, well, I'm trying to keep my job here, and I'm just going to hang on to Sweat and Young and just keep everybody, right? And that wouldn't be the best thing for the Commanders long term. And so I guess I would say credit where it's due, whether it's to Rivera or to Harris or to Shen or whoever, to like realize where this team was at and understand that you can maximize the opportunity for the Commanders in 2024 to 2028 if you start making some moves now.
Gotcha. One last one before we get out of here. I'm curious what your thoughts were on Sam Howell before the draft and kind of where you're at with him now.
My biggest concern, I don't have a ton of player takes when it comes to prior to the draft, but I did have one on Howell, which I'm on record for. So I'm not just saying this in retrospect. I did write about or do videos about my concern that he had a sack problem coming out of North Carolina, and that's turned out to be true. And I believe me, I get a million things wrong. Okay, that was just one good call. Howell's sack problem to me is the biggest problem. Though his numbers are alarming, he's obviously been better over the last 2 weeks. 4 sacks in the last 2 games. It's pretty good. He's brought the sack rate down. He's still in double digits. It's really hard to / impossible live in a world where you're taking sacks 10% of the time. What he has a game to overcome some of that. So like I always say, like, if you take a lot of sacks, it's not the end, but it just removes your margin of errors everywhere else. He's a high variance player, so like there's upside that can make up for that, and I think that is feasible. But I am mostly concerned because the traits of taking sacks, and he takes sacks at a high percentage of his pressures as well. So like you can, if you just, and that is quite a stable stat. I was looking at it today, looking at guys in their first 2 years, the rate at which they take sacks as a percentage of pressures, pretty stable to the rest of their career. And that is where he is poor. And so sack avoidance is a skill in and of itself for quarterbacks. It's one he doesn't have. And there are players who change in that department, but usually not. So that is what I would say is, to me, it's concerning. If you look at, he is in poor company when it comes to players who take sacks this much. The hits I'm not as concerned about. It's like, I know he's taking a lot of hits. That doesn't seem to correlate quite as strongly with poor performance down the road, but it's the sacks. Sacks as a percentage of pressures. I would say it's a pretty big red flag. But the last two games are interesting, right? Like, is that the start of a trend, or was it just a blip? I don't know, but I'll be watching closely over the next few weeks because I think he has to improve in that area. I think it would be very, very hard to imagine him succeeding without improving in a major way.
There's no doubt, and they've helped him the last couple of games with the offensive game plan, and some of that is the enemy. Getting used to everything's new is the problem, and there's no time for patience with the new staff. Although they have been patient. It's interesting. Somebody was on the show the other day and said, "Well, it looks like they've had him throwing so much to speed up the learning curve, I suppose, and getting him ready." And so if that was the plan, and we'll see if it works, but he has been better the last couple of games. So hopefully we can lean on play calling, but you're right, the sacks are alarming. Seth, I appreciate your time today, man. I think we learned a little bit and I enjoyed it. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's been great chatting. This has been fun.